And again, if there are any questions the board has on the delegated authority report, I'm happy to answer that. Otherwise, I'll move on to my
comments.
Some other items.
Will you please try your call again, please?
So we are being haunted, but actually there's an attempt to try to connect with board member Schweitzer, who will be joining us by phone. I was also going to note that board member Lehrbach had a conflict come up, business conflict come up at the last minute that he couldn't avoid. I think he's passed on some of his comments related to the business, and I'm sure the chair will, the board president will report those later as we get to that. Related to the general manager's report today, what I wanted to do is really focus again, once again, on safety. As you know, we've had our first meeting of the Safety and Service Excellence Task Force. It was a public session. They really reviewed in depth the Phase 1 K&J Independent Safety Review Report and the findings and recommendations that came from that. There was also substantial conversation and public testimony that the task force received. The second public session of the task force will be held actually tonight in the Portland building, and where we normally have our board meetings from 5 to 7. The focus of that will be a presentation from the independent safety consultant, actually Jim Tucci from K&J Consulting, and that will also summarize, if you will, any questions or issues that came up in the review of the Phase 1 report, but also then focus on the Phase 2 report, which I'll report on a little bit more in just a moment. We'll also cover the safety outreach efforts that the agency has undertaken historically and begin to have the committee engage on that, and obviously there'll be substantial time set aside for public comment and observation as well. And as you recall, the goal of the task force is the challenge to migrate TriMet to the highest levels of safety performance and thereby improve our performance in all areas of business. So the task force is underway. I'm actually encouraged by the first meeting. The depth and level of conversation, I think, was really outstanding. I'm looking forward to a great result from that. Again, their work is scheduled to take place between now and the end of October, and we'll be reporting back to the board at that time. I also wanted to note just an update. We are in interviews right now for the Director of Safety and Security position. As you might recall, I made the switch in the organization where that position now reports directly to me. We'll have a strong dotted line to the Operations Department. We'll have independence, and again, the purpose of that is really to send a very strong message that safety is our #1 element of business here, and that it starts at the top and is the responsibility of every employee at TriMet. I did want to spend a little bit more time on the top-to-bottom safety review Phase 2 report. We provided you a copy of that fresh off the press, and it's also on our website for those who are interested in reviewing it at more and greater length. They did, during this phase, again, some on-site visits and reviews. Let me review some of the highlights in terms of the findings from that overall effort. Regarding bus operations, the most significant finding in this report was a deficiency that we take very seriously. What they deemed was that our distribution of standard operating procedures, or SOPs for short, to our bus operators is haphazard, and that there was no sort of secured way of knowing that the operator had received and understood the content of that SOP over time and the changes that occurred to that document over time. So we clearly agree that we need to do a better job of ensuring that. As I think we noted before in response to one of the comments in the Phase 1 report, we're now progressing our annual training program for operators to be an annual recertification. And part of that recertification will indeed include making sure they have full knowledge of the SOPs and any changes that occurred to the SOPs since they were last in training, together with regular updates and distributions that are formal, include a sign-off, include acknowledgement that the operator has received those. So those will be, I think, an important change in our policies and procedures as we move forward. We also had K&J look at this, their scope was to look at the bus stop placement. And actually they noted, in terms of a very positive comment, that our bus stop placement guidelines and criteria, essentially design criteria for bus stops, was unique in the industry in a positive sense, actually acknowledged that it was a very good advancement in terms of standard practice for the industry. But when they went out and looked at the field, they found some dissonance between what was actually out in our system and our bus stops. We'll talk about that a little bit later with one of the agenda items, but I think that it did spotlight that there's a great difference between the built environment that we operate in and that environment that we'd like to operate in terms of sidewalks and stopping places for bus stops. So one of their suggestions was that we more frequently update those bus stop guidelines to reflect our actual practice in placing these bus stops and the adjustments that the real world frankly forces upon us as we do that. They also recommended that we continue our line-by-line review and assessment of each of our bus lines to look at the operating conditions. You might recall that we've begun that and actually have made some changes in some of the key lines associated with the placement of stops and their configuration with turns and lane changes to make sure that that we are not asking the operators to do anything that is unsafe, certainly not illegal, but certainly unsafe in terms of its best practice. So, for example, that's the issue of trying to make lane changes quickly after a bus stop to make a turn. We now realize we need to make sure that there's a good distance that's allowed for an operator to make a lane change before they're asked to make a left turn or a right turn, as the case may be. In terms of bus procurement, they recommended some adjustments to our normal practice, which is fundamentally to add a member of the safety department to the bus procurement committee so that we make sure that safety and security issues are well addressed in our bus procurements, and so we will do that. The other issue that they brought to bear is that there's a dissonance here between what we have traditionally done with our rail projects and our bus procurements. And our rail projects for rail cars and all of our light rail systems and facilities, we go through a very elaborate safety certification process, which is a very detailed checklist of making sure that everything about safety has been thought about and resolved and signed off before the project is ready to open, or the facility is ready to open. So, for example, we'll be doing that here in the next few months with our Rockwood Station redesign in Gresham and the Gresham Civic Station as well. We haven't traditionally done that with the new buses, so they're recommending that we establish that safety certification process for new buses as well, so that will be done. Regarding that safety certification for major capital projects, they brought to our attention that the same staff that are responsible for construction safety administration are also responsible for safety certification, and they recommended that that may be too much of a load for those individuals to carry, so additional augmentation of construction staff to make sure that there is plenty of capacity to deal with these important safety issues, both during construction of a project and leading to its operation, and safety certification would be important. So we'll be looking at that and making sure that the staffing plans for any capital projects we have going forward accommodate that. It was also recommended that we establish minimal qualifications for construction contractor safety personnel so that we make sure that we get very qualified people on the part of the contractors who we hire to do our construction work. And typically we do require for major contracts that the contractor hire a full-time safety person or more to administer the safety program at the contract level. Regarding rail operations, they recommended that we increase the length of our training program from 7 weeks to 8 weeks to provide some additional time for all the issues that the rail operators need to deal with. They did note, for example, that our annual observation rides that we do with rail operators is an industry best practice, and they regarded that highly. But they did note that there may be a bit of a disconnect between the correction of a hazard and the follow-up activities that we take to make sure that that identification of a hazard has been dealt with and closed in an appropriate manner. So, for example, one of those issues that we have dealt with has been the use of rear-facing cameras on our Type 4 light rail vehicles, which were originally designed not to have mirrors. And so we actually received some issues and complaints from operators that they wanted to rely on mirrors. So mirrors were installed, and then we probably didn't properly go through with each of the operators to describe when you use a mirror, when you use a rear-facing camera. They're both important safety devices, but we perhaps were not as diligent as we should have been as sort of closing that issue in terms of the communication with the operators.